We have been doing web archiving at the British Library for over 10 years now. So altogether, all the collections, including the historical collection from the JISC, we have about over 6 billion resources that measures over 100 terabytes of compressed data. So some of the later presentations today will actually show and demonstrate the difficulties in working with this data set of such large scale and combined with other issues. I guess we're not one of the early nations who passed legal framework to enable domain-level systematic collection of web resources. That in itself, it's a blessing to some extent. Okay, we didn't collect this material, but we had energy and time to think about something else, namely access and use of the web archive. So prior to April 2013, we actually spent quite a lot of time archiving the web in a very detailed way, curating website, building collections, adding metadata, and the Open UK Web Archive, I think, is one of the best user interface in terms of displaying or offering navigation to individual websites. And also strategically, we decided, despite the, non-print legal deposit not yet in place, strategically we decided that an important area is the proactive development of access and use. And also we realized without talking to our users, it's going to be quite difficult knowing what to do. So I think we consciously, engaged with researchers, and that went through a path as well. This is just as new to us as to you, I guess. So we did user surveys showing people the UK Web Archive, the Open UK Web Archive, asking questions. Is this what you expect? Does this meet your requirements? We also involved the researchers in very early days in content selection and curation. So they would help or work with us curating thematic collections, and we also run tons of brainstorm sessions and workshops and asking people, what might be your research questions? I mean, these were all very helpful, but there were problems or related to these approaches as well. It's only in the recent years that we started, working more closely with the researchers in a more detailed way. So co-developing access, with the researchers through research projects. And one of the examples of this is the big UK Domain Data for Arts and Humanities project. And a number of us, I think, will present the outputs or learning from that project later. And this, I think, has significantly impacted the way we do things here at the library. We have learned quite useful and valuable lessons. So what I'm going to do here today, hopefully, is to sort of reflect on some of these learnings without going into the details. I mean, you will see the details followed by my presentation, but I'm going to try to focus on the big picture and tell you what exactly have we learned. So I just said it's a learning process for both of us. For us, knowing what we should do to help to support research use. For you to know what this archived web exactly is. What's the methodology you use to for this to be the primary source for your research. And also we started, as Peter explained, with focusing on providing access to individual resources, websites. I think we have almost exhausted all the possible way of looking at individual web pages. And then we also moved on from that level to look at archived web resources as data set, the big picture. And then I think it took us a while to realize that it's really not a choice between big data or small data. You really need both. And perhaps what we are looking for is this microscope of the UK web history. I think Tim Hitchcock will come later today. And this is a concept he picked up and developed and expanded. I think really what we're looking at perhaps is a single data point, which you can quickly drill down to look at the large-scale context around that, but also to come back and look at the individual details and examine that. So we also learned that it's not just the actual HTML text printed on the screen that is relevant. There is context and paratext. They're just as important, and I'll explain this with examples later on. And there's also the user expectation and assumption, which I think Richard and Gareth will be very capable of explaining and giving example about this. What this is I think a lot of us are used to Google search. Do you apply that to this context as well? So when you do that, what kind of assumptions do you make? You know, how do you expect us to sort search results, and what should be on top? Because of the scale of the archive, you typically get a lot of results. How do you sort that? How do you support, and how do you support the underlying assumption? And there's also the general public. When they come to the archive, they have a different expectation and assumption. Based on figures, we know they come to the web archive to look for websites which have become inactive and disappeared from the web. And maybe there is that actually put us on the thought to highlight that in our next generation user interface so that people can find them straight away. For a group of users, that would be a good use case. And we also learned that we tend to, some of the information, contextual, especially non-textual data information, we consider as private or operational. We don't have the habit of making them available. And one of the probably the most significant learning of the working with researchers is that we need to maximize transparency so that together we probably come up with a acceptable and usable methodology to work with this data. And the last thing I would say, scale remain a challenge. We are doing a lot of data shifting. We collected 51 terabytes of compressed data. Last domain crawl, we're about to start the next one. It's only going to increase. So, in terms of next steps, I think this is quite specific to the Buddha project, so I will probably not go into it per se. But I think I'll cover a little bit, talk a little bit about the Open UK Web Archive. We're going to redevelop very soon. So the project actually started. What we try to develop would be a seamless interface for all the three components of the UK Web Archive. So we talked about non-print legal deposit, which is a legal framework or an exemption of the copyright law. What that allows us is to collect comprehensively of copyright web resources, but in exchange, that material is not available openly. So you have to come to the library physically to look at them in the reading rooms, and there are other additional restrictions. But what we want to do with the redevelopment of the Open UK Web Archive is that we want to make available knowledge or metadata about our complete collections, including all these three components. So you will see when you search something, hopefully you'll be able to search everything which is in our possession. And also we would like to be able to link into other web archives. So Peter mentioned that there are many web archives in the world. I think the recent figure is 63 initiatives across 55 countries, 17 petabytes of resources archived, or something like that. So the web is a global thing. When we come to the archiving of it, we chop them into pieces. Typically, a national library or a nation would take on the responsibility of preserving and archiving them for heritage purposes, which is great. But then the boundary is arbitrary when it comes to research use. Quite often, I think Gareth is the one who mentioned that in his Buddha report. When it comes to a research question, you all of a sudden realize what you want is the global web. You don't necessarily need those boundaries. They're not helpful. So with the UK Web Archive, we're going to make better use of a technology which helps to string back together all the dispersed web archives, so that there is that function already available on the UK Web Archive. It allows you to search any URL and tells you where in the world which web archives have archived that URL and how many times, and offers a way into those web archives if they are openly available. So with that in mind, we think we probably should be able to see to show people a comprehensive set of UK data, but also a bit of the international or the global context. Bear in mind we're dealing with the web. And the other things on the slide really is about support for specific research, how people can build a corpus or a manageable corpus, out of such a large-scale archive. And how do we interpret manageable here? This is something I would like to discuss with Richard and Gareth later on. Does manageable mean human readable, or other things we could do to make it manageable, not necessarily just manageable for human eyes? Really what we're looking at is to try to reflect our learnings and put that back into the development, so that we can include more data, more content, and attract more people to use it. I mean, because taxpayer is funding this activity, I think one of the things we want to achieve is also that the UK Web Archive becomes the UK Wayback Machine, if you like. When people can't find things on the live web, they know where to go. So one of the things I mentioned was to highlight the websites which have become inactive. We have the technical means to discover that. I'm going to spend a little bit of time, if I may, to talk about the topic of transparency. We don't have the exact way of how we do this yet, but I want to give a few examples, just tell you about the sort of operational or private data which we didn't use to make available, and also to discuss with you, is this the sort of thing you would like to know? So starting with crawdate, Peter mentioned about a few things like the CDX index, and also crawdate or time is actually used to organize web archives, both at a technical level and a user interface level. But this is quite misleading, because if you look at go into a web archive for the first time, you see all these dates. You think, okay, that's when the website is made or produced. No, it's not. It's when that website is captured. So these two dates, publication date and crawl date, they don't overlap. If they do, it's not intentional. So they are irrelevant. So this is something which I'm not sure that people are aware of. I think we should make it clear, which doesn't really take a lot to do. So in this context, I picked up something which is quite interesting. So there's a court case out of 2007 where a online game website was archived pages of an online game site from the Internet Archive was submitted to the patent office in a patent case. So the person is trying to use that archived page, funnily printed out on paper, and to show the court, look, I came up with the idea first. However, the verdict is that it cannot be used as evidence because it doesn't meet the standard of proof without further evidence concerning the history of the disclosure, whether and how it has been modified since the date it originally appeared on our website. That is just bang on. It actually describes some of the problems or issues associated with archived web resources. First of all, availability of date. It was very difficult to determine. So it's the crawl date, which is mentioned on the archive pages. It cannot be determined that the relationship of the crawl date and the date where the game was made, if you see what I mean. And it wasn't really helpful that the game component wasn't archived with the Internet Archive copy either, because it was online, interactive. The crawler wasn't capable of archiving it. So the printed out pages from the Internet Archive was merely circumstantial. It probably provides some information about something once existing in the past, but not exactly clear when. And you also cannot know how the online game looked at that point of time, and from that to determine who invented it first, by way of speaking. So I think this is quite an important point, and I want to make sure that people know about it. The next thing, those who have used the web archive, you come across this a lot. It says resource not in archive. So you probably will just accept that. But then if you wondered why, I can give you a whole list of reasons which could trigger this error message. And sometimes we know about the reasons, but we can't even necessarily say at what point when this message appears, this is related to which scenario, which I'm going to tell you about. So for example, Peter talked about permission. So if we have no permission to the linked content from a web page, it's not in archive. We can't collect it. You see this message. Sometimes robots.txt, which is a protocol at the web server level, hosting website, telling people what to crawl and not to crawl. So sometimes robots.txt says, don't crawl this part of my website. And we obey that to some extent. So if that's not picked up because we follow robots.txt, it'll trigger that message. And also, we're talking about the UK Web Archive, right? Non-print legal deposit says, UK website is defined as everything which is hosted using .uk plus everything else which is not using .uk but produced by UK organizations and individuals. So let's not talk about how difficult the second bit of the legislation it is for us to implement technically, but you see at the edge of a national archive you inevitably have links to other parts of the web which will not be in there, which again will trigger the message. And also in order to control resources and make the best use of resources, we impose data volume limitations when we do our big domain crawl. We have a standard cap, per host, which we use. So for example, if it's 20 levels from the starting point, if that's reached, the crawler will just gracefully exit. And also there were technical informations. I just mentioned the online game was not picked up by the Internet Archive because it was technically too difficult. So we can't do any interactive element, JavaScript, database-driven, anything dynamic, and streaming media, social network. So a lot of holes in there. And then again, you'll see resource not in archive. So not ideal, but maybe some people would like to know what might be the reason triggering this and follow from there. So in the UK Web Archive, what we have done is actually to avoid a dead end in navigation at this point, if you see that. We offer a link to the live web, but also we use this service I just described, where you can search or find out which other web archives in the world may have archived this. So this probably is quite serious. I don't know how we deal with this, and I would like to hear from you. So this is something called the temporal inconsistency. So what this means, I'll show you an example, and those in the audience who are historians need to tell me what we do about this. So a web page, regardless if it's from an archive or the live web, typically would pull together, to render a page on a screen, it involves pulling different resources, hosted by different URLs. So what we get in terms of temporal consistency in the web archive, what I'm talking about is a rendered page marked with a single date time, crawl date, consisting of resources crawled at different times and never existed together. I'll explain to you why that is. So there is some recent research looking at this problem. They looked at 4,000 archived web pages. 5% has this temporal, typo there, violation. The span of weeks or months is quite common. So you have, like, on a rendered page, the newest and the oldest element making up that rendered page is not from the same time. So the time span could be months and weeks. But in the most extreme cases, that time span could be 5 or even 10 years. So what exactly are we looking at here? So I'm going to show you an example from the Icelandic archive. So this is a web page dated, if you go to the archive, I think it's dated 1998, May the 7th. So there's a date stamp there. So this is a page from 1998. Would you doubt it? No, you think this is a page from 1998. But this is a frame set, right? So there's top frame, and if you access the frame content directly, it was captured in December 2000. So this page you looked at was never there. It didn't exist, yet you're showing this. So I don't know what we do with it, but I do know that you need to know about this. And in the most extreme cases, like I say, that time span could be even 10 years. Does this matter? I know why this is the case, because this is someone trying to be helpful, those who wrote the Wayback software, because it's better to give you something more complete than giving you pages with holes and gaps, right? That's, I think, the thought behind it. And also, perhaps also some degree of temporal drift doesn't matter. It really depends on how frequently you pick up the website. The more frequent you crawl them, the rate of change is less. So it's probably, okay. The time span, the smaller time span, probably doesn't necessarily mean content change. Probably means less content change. And also, if you think about the same URL pointing to different CSS files, it only alters the appearance, not the intellectual content, right? Changes in frame set, page footer, or header, they don't affect, to a large extent, the interpretation of the text. But that is under the assumption that text is the object of study, right? What if people are interested in paradox, context, and all the things making up a page which, is beyond text? How do we deal with that? And what can we do about this? So the same people from the Old Dominion University who did the research about the temporal span came up with a framework to assess temporal coherence. I think all archives in the world should use this framework and apply that onto their data and have an understanding of the temporal span of their collections and make that available to the users. And also, I'm going to show you a screenshot, which is really neat. So the Memento framework, I talked about earlier, which allows you to pull resources from different web archives, have recently come up with this. So if you go to their service, imagine this not as a web archive itself, but a layer on top of web archives which holds metadata and can pull resources from dispersed web archives globally. So if you go to this web archive, go to the Memento service, you type a URL and you indicate a time. I want to see this page from that point in time. It will first show you a list of all the relevant captures of that URL, at different times. You can go into each of them. They will have hosts. So they'll show you how the crawler archived it, or they'll show you the realistic HTTP level transaction between the crawler and the web server at the time. So you will see a lot of holes on the page, each of them. But then it offers you a reconstruct button. When you click on it, it pulls elements from different archives and assemble this page for you. But the help here is the visualization on top. It tells you how many copies it got from which archives and from which time, and how many are still missing if they can't patch the page comprehensively. So here, this page is using 10 different elements from 2 different web archives spanning over 2 years. Is that helpful? I think so. And we can probably take it a bit further, offer native support in the software way back to allow people to indicate, I am going to ask you to pull together, to patch together a page for me, but the time span should not be as long as 5 years or should be as short as 2 days, by way of speaking. So giving people the option to define that time span, to understand, and also by looking at the pages with hosts and without hosts, you actually will be in a much better position, understanding how things were at one point in time. So I think these are the things which will help scholars to answer the underlying conceptual questions and develop a methodology to deal with material like this. Because if this temporary inconsistency exists, what are we exactly looking at? We know the court said you can't use that as evidence. Fine, we accept that, right? But what are we looking at? They're not exactly copies. They're something new, reborn. So is it still valid? Is that different from how you deal with incomplete versions of manuscript traditionally, and how? I don't know. I think from our point of view, before any solutions or answers are found to these questions, I think the best thing we can do we bear in mind and try to incorporate into the services we offer going forward. Okay, right. Any questions?
Helen, could you just say a word about the Memento approach you explained? Is that a prototype, or is that something that is being implemented, or in the process of being implemented, or what's the state of play, I suppose?
Yeah, so Memento started as a project at the US Asolomus National Lab. And it started as a project and got fundings, but I think very recently, I think the lab seems to have taken the responsibility of maintaining the service at a more sustainable footing. So they've changed the way, so the lab is now behind the provider of the service, and also I think this has been used in many research projects and by more and more web archives. So I have no reason to think this should disappear. I think this is one of the best things we have to offer wider access to web archives and to help us get around some of the restricted access to our own collection. And I think also, I think the good thing about this really is that it's making use of the HTTP protocol as it is. So just, requesting time and date. So I think there's definitely more to do about it. And also, I'm quite pleased with what they have done recently, showing the visualization of different elements from different archives. I think really it's a realization of how some of these things, underlying things which were considered as irrelevant, has become relevant, and how it's very encouraging also to see not just the memento service, but also effort elsewhere in Denmark and here in the UK are actually sort of pushing us into a different approach of providing access to web archives. Yeah. Thanks. Okay.
Helen, can I just highlight a couple of things that I think were really very valuable in what you said there.
Okay.
I think the first thing for a lot of perhaps in the audience who haven't necessarily used web archives that much is what you get through the Wayback Machine isn't necessarily what was there originally, and I think that's an absolutely crucial point.
Yes.
And related to when does it date to exactly, and things like that, and whether it is sort of a collage from different things. The temporal inconsistency you mentioned and everything else, and I think those are absolutely fundamental, because we approach these things, as you indicated, like in terms of searching with Google, with certain preconceptions, and unfortunately, unless it's you very rightly, and I can't praise that enough, the importance of transparency. And I think that's something that web archives are beginning to learn and
Yes.
approach and understand. Maybe the Internet Archive not as much as perhaps it could do, but that's one of the way it needs to go, is to provide that kind of information so that you avoid the preconceptions that we have by using the normal everyday online web.
Yeah.
Because it isn't the same. It's something
Exactly.
different.
Yeah.
And I think that's the different aspects of that you've shown here are absolutely crucial, and I think that's a fundamental point. As a researcher approaching using web archives, it isn't what it actually was. It's something slightly different, and you need to know the different elements and aspects that make it.
I almost feel ashamed to tell you that when I told some of our curators about this, they were shocked. They didn't know either. So this really points to a problem. How Peter, I think, raised this in other contexts. What was really driving web archiving? I think technology has driven it, so far. But the good thing is that when people start to use the web archive, it actually these problems become apparent. Yeah.